Before we get started today, guys, I just wanted to give a shout out real quick to our friends over at Close the Yearbook. It's another fantastic podcast hosted by three great guys that mixes sports with pop culture and has exciting guests on it that are promising future athletes. You can listen to Close the Yearbook on Podbean as well as the Podbean app, and they will be linked in the description of my YouTube video. Welcome to episode 3 of Bar4Bar, guys. I am your host, Jack Bender. Thank you guys for tuning in and for the tremendous support on the first 2 episodes. I'm so excited to get into what I want to talk about today. But first, I wanted to make a quick announcement about the show. As you guys could probably tell right now by what you're viewing, we will be transitioning over to sound format for the show. However, you will still be able to see the audio uploaded to YouTube as well as all other available platforms. This is largely due to the COVID-19 crisis, the coronavirus crisis. It's put me out of range physically and work-wise with my editor, with my videographer, but he will still be editing the audio. If you're watching this on YouTube right now and you see those nice sound waves, shout out Willie Hustles for that. He is the best. Now, with no further ado, let's get started, guys. I'm going to start with this Joyner Lucas ADHD album review. This is the Massachusetts MC's debut studio album, as his first 2 projects were mixtapes. Joyner, prior to his album's official release, released 9 whole singles. That's a lot. That's a whole lot. And I mentioned this in episode 2, but they were not the most impressive back-to-tracks, unfortunately. But some stood out, though. Hard-hitting bangers like I Love and Isis were diamonds in the rough and had a lot more replay value to me than other singles, in my opinion. Thematically, this album is based off Joyner's experiences growing up with ADHD that he says he was diagnosed with as a child. Throughout the record, you see Joyner illustrate this overarching idea of him having this feeling of being an outcast because of his condition his entire life, especially during his childhood. He felt out of place. He felt like he was different. He felt like he was slower than other kids, and this shows in lots of the tracks, and I think especially is illustrated in the 4 skits on the project. The 4 skits being the first one, which is the very first track on the album. It's Joyner's doctor putting Joyner through a screening, which eventually leads to him using vulgar terms towards Joyner, and excuse my language, but he's calling Joyner a retard and a fuck-up. And it has Joyner feeling panicked. It has him feeling down on himself, as you can probably hear in the tone of his voice in the skit. The second skit is a celebrity cameo, which I personally enjoyed. It was Chris Tucker. He left Joyner a voicemail in which he is attacking him for not dropping the album that I am reviewing right now. He's blaming Joyner for making excuses and using his ADHD as kind of a crutch for not getting the album done and finished and released. The third one we see is Kevin Hart leaving Joyner a voicemail, trashing his single Lotto, which I don't blame him, and demanding that Joyner pay him back for money he borrowed from Kevin to avoid Joyner's Lamborghini getting repossessed. And then the fourth and final one, which is the last track we see on the album, is Joyner back at the doctor's office, and the doctor suggests lean and cocaine to Joyner as medication in place of his pharmaceutical prescription that he's not been taking. This is and Joyner is very unsure about sounding about this. The doctor's telling him to put it in his backpack, does not tell his parents, be all shh about it, and it's very uncomfortable tone from Joyner. You know, kind of almost the doctor admitting defeat. You know, just saying fuck it. I'm gonna give him this. I'm gonna give him this. Hopefully, it does the trick, and kind of showing this, kind of finalizing the idea that the doctor is a psychopath. He's kind of insane, and Joyner is not getting the correct treatment from him. The skits in this album seem to be an attempt at being the glue to hold the record together thematically, and if the intention was to create an album with lots of depth, message, theme, in terms of an overarching theme, it just did not succeed in that, in my opinion. And that is definitely not the only end on which this record did not succeed and totally disappointed me. Many of the tracks that were included on the official release and not as singles prior to that, even some of the singles, just sounded rushed. They sounded unfinished. And this is made evident by really, really pitiful mixing on tracks like The War with Young Thug and Goldmine. Joyner's vocals just don't even sound drowned by the instrumental as much as they do just quiet and obscure. And something you guys should know about me is that I see no excuse for poor mixing. If you have an artist, producer, engineer, and several others all working on the same track, the same project, the same record, whatever, there's no excuse why it should sound so incomplete. You're listening to that back, and you're listening to, the vocal levels. You're listening to the instrumental in comparison to the vocals, and there's no reason it should just sound like the instrumental is taking total command over the delivery, the songwriting, anything like that, and it just disappoints me. I will never ever excuse that. As far as the production on this record goes, it's very hit or miss the way I see it. Rarely does Joyner recompense for it with his performance, unfortunately. The one exception off this record that I will say I really enjoyed is the third track and also the third single released off the project, Isis, featuring Logic. Although the sample and instrumental is very generic, the little da 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 da, the way the bass hits in between the short pauses of Joyner's bars aids Joyner's delivery very well, despite the sample just being very generic, very low effort sounding. Like it's just like the first thing he pulled up in FL Studio and said, "Fuck it, I'm gonna use this." It just or some sort of like I don't even know what instrument that could be. I think it was literally just a sample used and looped for the entire track, the entirety of the track. But I do have to also give credit to Logic, surprisingly enough, for his verse here. The feature verse from Logic on this track alone is better than 90% of his last album. Let's be honest, Confessions of a Dangerous Mind was not up to par by any standards and might have been is easily in the discussion for Logic's worst studio album, worst album period. But on this track, he really came through. He seemed to have a chip on his shoulder. His wordplay is slick. His delivery is commanding over the instrumental. He even switched up his flow a few times without sounding off beat or out of place alongside the instrumental. However, as I mentioned earlier, Joyner does fall short on making up for any lackluster and sometimes generic production on other tracks. 10 Bands is a prime example of this. The track is produced, unfortunately, surprisingly, by Timbaland. And I gotta say, even aside from this track, I've just been disappointed lately with Timbaland's production on a number of projects and singles. An example being T Grizzly's 2019 release, Scriptures. Timbaland produced the majority of that album, and the production was just so underwhelming. It did not do justice to the performance of Grizzly on many of the tracks, who, by the way, is incredibly talented as a trap MC, and I just did not think Timbaland's production was up to par by any stretch of the imagination. Anywho, the beat to 10 Bands just sounds so hollow, empty, largely due to little else accompanying those trap drums you hear in the back. To me, the bounce effect that Timbaland seemed to be going for with the production to produce a club banger type beat just doesn't do it for me. And not to mention the hook to this track. Oh my god, it's so obnoxious. It's generically written, it's gimmicky in such an off-putting way, it just does not resonate well. But I do have to give credit to Joyner for his performance and songwriting, including the hook, on the track Will, though. The references to half a dozen of Will Smith's biggest films didn't feel corny or forced. They didn't feel out of place. They felt cleverly and carefully worked in there, which to me indicates dedicated songwriting, because anyone could just force a bunch of references in there, but they were worked in there in a very slick way, which I appreciated. And not to mention that the beat sounded pretty solid and complemented Joyner's performance rather nicely. And as far as other hooks on the record that I did enjoy, finally by Joyner featuring Chris Brown, while it does sound a bit poppy, bit of mainstream commercial appeal, clearly, it sounds good even with Joyner doing the first half of the hook. I listened to the beginning of the song, I hear Joyner come on at first. I'm like, wait, there's a Chris Brown feature, right? I checked the track list, I'm like, yeah, why isn't he on the hook? And then it actually sounds nice. Like, Joyner comes through, almost throws a little lob up to Chris Breezy to come in on the second half of the hook with that smooth vocal performance we all know from Chris Brown. And honestly, it adds a lot of replay value to the song. Obviously, the verses, they're solid, not Joyner's best songwriting ever, but the track has a lot of replay value for me. It resonates with me a bit better than lots of the other ones. Or even the album's intro track, which is I Lied, where Joyner delivers a very abrasive vocal performance on the hook, which I kind of personally interpret as expressive of Joyner's pain and hurt that he feels as a result of, feeling like this outcast, feeling like this, this singled out one, despite everything else, despite every, bit of, support he might be getting to tell him on the contrary. And this theory would actually make sense considering the first track was a skit prior to it. Like, it came directly before it. So this could be like maybe a track in response to it. And I definitely see that as being the best theory available here, the best theory to put out there. Everything considered, I do think some more inspired production and meticulous work on the mixing would make an enormous difference and the turnaround of this record, enormous. However, I think more importantly, a greater sense of direction could have done a lot of good for ADHD. And the reason I say this is because while this isn't the case for every album, I think if Joyner was more focused on creating a thematically grounded body of work, I believe the album would be a lot more concrete, a lot more memorable, a lot more listenable, and a lot less of an exhausting listen from front to back. I say this because sonically, the appeal wasn't there on a lot of these tracks. It seemed that Joyner was trying too hard to create replay value on some tracks and not trying hard enough to make a more finished piece on others, therefore resulting in such a mixed bag where it just leaned more towards poor and poorly produced, poorly mixed than it did something that was memorable, something that we'll remember. And that's disappointing because all in all, again, this Joyner Lucas ADHD project is a disappointment on several fronts, but Joyner is such a talented MC. Even you hear tracks like projects like the one with the whole full number. I'm not gonna rehearse, and then along came Joyner. I hear tracks like I'm Sorry off one of those projects, and I hear total potential to be one of the best MCs in all of hip hop today, and that just didn't show on this album. Obviously Joyner and prior to then had been releasing a lot of like remixes to songs, and even on Instagram he was saying like I'm getting back to that after the ADHD drops. I don't know. I mean, he's trying to find himself musically and artistically still. And while he's got bars, he's got talent, no doubt in anyone's mind. There should be no doubt in anyone's mind. But again, he's just trying to find himself musically. He needs to find his best. He needs to find his best self and where he excels in music, because this project was not at all an exhibit of that. I'm gonna give this Joyner Lucas ADHD project a 3 out of 10. Again, a really big disappointment from Joyner. Was expecting more, especially from an MC as talented as him. Now, I'm also going to talk about now the YNW Melly double murder case. So, as many of you know, Melly has been in prison for over a year on 2 charges of first-degree murder and is currently awaiting trial. It broke news recently, and this is very recent, as in last 3-4 days, that Melly's lawyer said he was diagnosed with the coronavirus COVID-19. More recent updates, even closer to now than that, said that Melly and his legal team are saying that Melly is dying from the virus in jail and behind bars due to a total lack of preparation and precautions taken by the prison. No health mask or anything, whatever the hell you want to call it. There's no treatment being given by any prison officials or medical officials. He's receiving no medical aid or little to none to help, and is just being essentially left to die. Melly's lawyer also echoed that Melly is claiming his cellmate also had COVID-19, hence being how Melly most likely contracted the virus, how Melly believes he contracted the virus. Now, I just want to touch on this really quick because I think there's a few things to be said about Melly's situation as a whole, as well as the virus in particular. To this day, a year and 1 month after turning himself in on 2 charges, 2 accusations of first-degrey murder, not a single bit of Melly's DNA was found at the crime scene. That includes the car that the prosecutors played a vital role in staging that drive-by shooting, and not anywhere even close to the surrounding areas in which the crime occurred. Melly has been waiting trial for over a year, with the only evidence being against him being his own song lyrics, and now Melly is quite literally rotting behind bars because of some bars, ironically enough, and of course not to mention his association with the real killers, them apparently being comrades or friends or associates of somehow. Melly pleaded not guilty to both counts of first-degree murder, and based on the evidence shown thus far, it would shock me to see him found guilty. I really am giving him the benefit of the doubt on this, as well as just the benefit of all the evidence put forward, or lack thereof, put forward. I think Melly will be a free man, hopefully not a dead man, though. And on that note, number 2, let him out of there. Hillsborough County in Florida just last week, not even a little over last week, released over 150 inmates. Those inmates were all non-violent convicts, but the facts as well as the odds are so in Melly's favor legally that is it really going to make a difference? Like, at this point, or you're somewhat certain that he is an innocent man at this rate. At least the way I see it, I think the way a lot of other people see it who have knowledge on the situation. Plus, the worst case scenario, if you're really that worried about him, put him on a strict form of house arrest. You can have people that will sit out there. You can have, your parole monitor sit out there. You can get an ankle bracelet. All that. There's so much that can be done to avoid this right now, and little to none is being done. And meanwhile, YNW Melly, a beloved rapper, and this is not, and not to mention, this is not just Melly. This is all inmates, because apparently this Florida jail is known for not doing anything with this as of late. This is in Hillsborough County, or near Hillsborough County, excuse me. And it's just kind of frustrating because you not only look at Melly, who obviously we all know and love, as a talented hip hop artist with a lot of potential, but there's just so much more that can be done for the rest of the inmates that maybe have a similar problem. I mean, it's just said his cellmate had the disease, and I don't think it's just pure coincidence that it's him. I think there's many others that were maybe diagnosed, undiagnosed, whatever. And I think there's a lot that could be done that just isn't being done. And it's certainly frustrating on our end, the fans' end, as well as Melly and his team's end. This is actually going to wrap up episode 3, guys. Thank you all so much for listening. We're going to be back next week with another one. Again, I and all of us appreciate all the continued support for the show. You can expect the episode 3. I apologize for being up a bit late today, episode 4 will be up next week around 4 o'clock. I anticipate I will be in touch with all of you guys. I will keep you guys posted on all my socials. Once again, thank you so much for watching. This has been Jack Bender, host of Bar4Bar, signing off.